Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month, a time to raise awareness about the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities in all areas of community life, as well as barriers that some still face in connecting to the communities in which they live. Tonight we have a panel of 3 guests that we look forward to learning from in this live discussion. In studio we have Lena Nguyen, Miss Wheelchair Utah 2020, Libby O. Segura, the Executive Director of the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, and via Zoom, Tiquani Oliver, a performance artist and board member of the Disabled Rights Action Committee. Woo, that was a mouthful. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to have all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I love to be here.
Lena, let's start with you. How do you define disability? And you can answer from your own perspective or your lens on that question overall.
For me, my disability is my identity, it is who I am. Even though, yeah, the car crash turned me into a quadriplegic, but now it is who I am, it is my lifestyle. So I wear it proudly, and that's how it feels like to me.
Tiquani, let's hear from you. How do you define disability?
I think it's important to remember how I define it is really not what matters. I really think that we should rather turn that around to suggest to those who aren't disabled and let them know they shouldn't define us. And I think that's where the problem lies, is how can they take this tidbit of information and actually show the community how they can tangibly and productively show up for us. So it's not so much how I define myself, because I'm good with that, it's how others seem to define us. That's the problem.
2 very interesting, unique, but diverse perspectives on this. Tiquani, not all disabilities are physical. Can you talk about what life might be like for someone living with a disability that may be invisible to others?
Well, I have 2 that would be considered invisible unless you knew what the characteristics of. I have ADHD and overlapping autism, which I wasn't diagnosed autistic until a few years ago. And it's those things that you don't see. It's the ways that, like I said, the community not knowing us, we know them, they don't really know us. And again, like, that's somewhat the problem of assuming someone's acting out for attention. The last thing I want is attention when I'm having a meltdown.
And I think that's what the awareness and education is aiming to do, is provide this level, right, of awareness that disabilities can come in all forms. Turning to you now, Libby, can you provide data and stats that we have about our community members with disabilities in Utah?
Surely. So disability cuts across the boundaries of race, gender, socioeconomic status, really anyone at any time in their life. And 1 in 5 Utahns is currently living with a disability or will experience one throughout their lifetime. And I'm representing 3% of the population, which are people with developmental and intellectual disabilities today. And I would say across the board, people with disabilities are chronically underemployed or unemployed. For instance, 74% of working-aged adults who want a job have a job, as compared to only 34% of people with disabilities who want to work. And across the United States, the buying power of people with disabilities is huge. It's nearly $500 billion. So creating space and opportunity for people with disabilities to obtain employment really has a positive impact not only on people's individual quality of life, but can do really wonderful things for our economy.
I love that you included some of the statistics and data to talk about the contributing factor of our community members with disabilities, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more later in this discussion. Lena, society is built in a way that preferences individuals without disabilities, and this creates challenges, barriers, and difficulty for those with disabilities. What are some that you've experienced, and how do we do better as a community to fix that?
Well, a lot of things that I've experienced has to do with transportation and housing, especially here in Utah. Transportation is hard to come by, especially after hours. We would have to pay double the amount of Uber or getting a Lyft. or getting a lift is not here in Utah. And so we would have to pay double the amount for a company to come and pick us up just to go to somewhere that we want, and that really puts a budget in our money. And so with housing, like, there's a lot of places that are not ADA wheelchair accessible, and so it's hard to go in, and businesses that don't go with ADA regulation, which affects us hardly.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we are continuing to work on and we need to do better on. Tiquani, what are some of the mentalities, stereotypes, and attitudes about the disability community that we need to challenge as a society?
Even though I think society thinks it's inclusive, and it's absolutely, we can see in this age and generation, has widened its aperture to who it includes, the narrative still needs to be reminded that the reason that we are marginalized, those of us who are disabled, especially those of us who are QT BIPOC or POC, and don't fall under the other alphabets, that we're humans. We're just like you. The difference is, and as I have an invisible, but I also now, as my time goes on, I have a physical disability. I use a walker and I have a power chair, and it's only now that I've become aware of how many things as a walking disabled person that I absolutely took for granted. And it doesn't need someone going out for a day in a wheelchair. It just takes some self-reflection and introspection on all of the things that you take for granted, and all the things I took for granted as someone who had full capacity.
You bring up great points. Now, all three of you hold that thought. We do have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. Before the break, we were joined by Lena Nguyen, Miss Wheelchair Utah 2020, Libby Oseguera, the Executive Director of the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, and via Zoom, Tiquani Oliver, a performance artist and board member of the Disabled Rights Action Committee. We pick up now right where we left off. We'll turn to you first, Lena. You have so many layers to your identity. Like all people living with disabilities, you are more than a diagnosis. You are well-rounded and multifaceted. Tell us more about what your identity encompasses.
For me, I'm not only disabled, I am a student. I go to school just like everyone else, and I love, hanging out with my friends, doing things with them, going shopping, watching movies, and I also just love reading and stuff like that. I'm more than just being disabled. I live my life just like everyone else, and we should see ourselves like that in our society.
Well said. Tiquani, let's hear from you.
Well, I'm a parent. I'm a healer in my community. I'm a well-respected elder that people come to for advice, because this has been a very long road having to deal with this. And, as a performance artist who is losing their physical capacity, I'm able to shine a light on others like myself that do perform. And we do create a lot of energy as performers, and we are great entertainers. And that entertainment and what you consume for your media doesn't have to have one narrow gaze.
Very well said, and I think it's a good reminder for all of us. Libby, how does lobbying work for recognition and funding with the intersectionality of identity? Is there competition for resources between different groups within the community? And if so, how is that overcome?
There are definitely a lot of groups competing for the same, pool of funding. However, we have a pretty strong community in Utah among our disability community. And generally speaking, we're getting better and better every year at coming up with unified priorities and advocating for those priorities together. Obviously, unfortunately, there's also unmet needs each year. For instance, there are 6,000 Utahns on a waiting list for community supports and services. And it has nothing to do with whether they're ineligible or don't have need. There's just inadequate funding for supports and services, and not enough capacity in our current service system to support people with disabilities to live independently in our communities.
Wow, it's just incredible how much work has been put into all this and how much more work needs to be done. Lena, turning now to the COVID-19 pandemic, what are your thoughts, experiences, or observations about how we've handled the pandemic for the disability community as a whole?
For me, I see that, you know, with the COVID situation, I think we should have been categorized under with the 65-year-old and olders. We should have been categorized with them because we are, in fact, I mean, we are like we are as immune compromised as much as the people who are 65 and older. So I think we should have been categorized with them at the same time, getting the vaccine and putting us as a priority.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that perspective. Libby, racial and ethnic minorities have higher rates of disability, and women are more likely than men to experience disability across their lifespan. Individuals of color who live with disabilities are more likely to experience poverty, violence, and trauma. How have the protests and efforts focused on identity over the last year brought to light long-lasting issues impacting the disability community?
Well, people with disabilities are much more likely to be victims of police violence, and research would show that people of color who also happen to be people with disabilities are twice the risk of being arrested before the age of 28, and I'd say most alarmingly, about 50% of people who are killed by law enforcement officers are people with disabilities.
That data and statistic is staggering to me, and I'm glad that we're talking about this so that we can bring this reality to light. Tikwani, I want to get your thoughts on this as well as adding a follow-up question. How have individuals with disabilities contributed to the efforts in the protests of 2020?
Well, I think also if we, you know, just right now we're just peeling back the layers, but also a lot of the training is very old training. Even medical providers, and these medical providers inform how police respond and engage with us. And we know that in medical school, it's still being taught that especially women, but Black and brown women, are considered to feel pain at a lesser capacity or a lesser intensity than white people. And so when we say we're in pain, when we make those claims of being in danger, feeling in danger, there's a lot of old information that's informing that. You know, if you can scream, you can breathe, and we see that's not true.
Yeah, that's something very important to bring up, is that when there's a cry for help, that person is at the point where they really need help. All right, Lena, Libby, and Tikwani, hold that thought. We have to take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. We pick up now with our three panel guests, Lena Nguyen, Libby Oseguera, and Tikwani Oliver. Libby, we'll start with you. What can communities do to recognize the importance of individuals who enjoy multiple identities and communities? How can we be respectful of these intersecting identities?
Well, having a disability is really just one part of a whole person, right? People have so many different identities, and it's really difficult to compartmentalize those different identities, and people are complex and multifaceted. So if communities can just embrace that people coming to contribute have all of these different identities and attributes, we really have more, diverse and healthy, strong communities. I think the way we can do that most respectfully is to ask questions and to let individuals identify themselves the way they want to be acknowledged and recognized.
I definitely think it doesn't hurt, it never hurts to have more conversations. Tiquani, let's talk about how our community members with disabilities contribute to society. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, one, the practice should be banned, but a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of employment and manufacturing that's done here in the United States is specifically and deliberately done by disabled individuals. It's often how they can be independent. My problem with that, though, is the pay is not equal pay. It's below minimum wage. But here locally, in July, which July should be ADA Pride Month, but it's not, we have a celebration, and we're giving, we're providing community resources, networking, entertainment, things that, contribute to society.
You bring up great points. Libby, I want to hear from you. How do our community members with disabilities contribute to society?
The same way that all community members do, right? Most people interact with someone with a disability every single day, whether that's a visible disability or not. People with disabilities are our teachers, our church members, our lawmakers, our neighbors. And so we all have passions and skills and abilities that we bring forward and contribute. And that's not any different for people with disabilities.
That's a great point. I think we need to look at our similarities instead of our differences. Lena, what can community members do to increase the positive visibility and representation of individuals with disabilities in the media, whether that's on the news or movies or etc.?
Yeah, I think people with disabilities should be given a chance in entertainment. Let them play different disability roles. Let them try out for those types of positions, and just give us a chance at the table in seeing more people with disabilities in leadership roles. Those type of things are much needed. That way we can open more doors and opportunities for our community.
That's a great point. Tiquani, I want to get you to chime in on this. What can we do to increase the positive visibility?
As an Indigenous person, it's part of our history, it's part of our roots to tell stories and be the keepers of history. And we know that this land is Turtle Island, and many of us who are Indigenous here are losing our stories and losing our culture to colonization. But many of us who are on the spectrum and also identify as being part of the trans community, we are a vital part of our own culture experience, and that those stories are never told. Stories of two-spirit healers and our mythology. And it's so rich, and there's so much that hasn't even been explored. It's why one of the things I do as a performer is to center and amplify Indigenous aesthetics from my tribes specifically, and to create stories as a filmmaker that highlight that we as Indigenous disabled people do things just like y'all.
And I think the key word here is just inclusion, really is what it comes down to. Lena, what are ways Utahns can support their community members who are living with a disability?
I think, ways is just to, if you see someone who's disabled, just be their friend, be there for them. And also, giving us the equal amount as other people's lifestyle. We're the same as you. We're living our life the way it is. And so being able to contribute towards society, being able to be seen in society can help us a lot.
I love that. Tiquani, let's hear from you.
My one thing is, don't patronize us or paternalize us. I'm a 41-year-old woman. I've climbed mountains in the Spanish Valley of Jacarinda. I've done things. I've cross-country, backpacked. I've lived a very full life, and the last thing I want is someone to make me a victim. or to make me out to be that trope of what disability is supposed to be. I'm a firecracker, and if I need your help, I'll ask for it. Just don't be weird.
You go, girl, and you preach. Libby, let's hear from you. Final answer on this. What are ways that Utahns can support their community members who are living with a disability?
I think we can all challenge the way that we think and perceive people with disabilities, and really dive deep into our bias that we hold, and advocate on behalf of your community members with disabilities for things like access to transportation and healthcare and affordable housing and everything that makes communities better, especially for people with disabilities.
Well said. I think all of us and everyone watching at home knows somebody who's living with a disability, and sometimes you may just not know it. All right, you've been hearing from Lena Nguyen, Miss Wheelchair Utah 2020, Libby Oseguera, the Executive Director of the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, and via Zoom, T. Kwani Oliver, a performance artist and board member of the Disabled Rights Action Committee. Thank you all for such a great panel discussion tonight. We really enjoyed having all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.